True crime tales from Pelican Bay Supermax, survival behind bars. The razor attack in the yard. The prison yard at Pelican Bay was silent, except for the sound of boots scraping concrete. Then it happened so fast no one saw it coming. A prisoner slipped a razor blade from his mouth, lunged forward, and slashed across another man's face. Blood sprayed across the yard. Guards shouted, alarms blared, and men hit the ground as chaos erupted. This wasn't just a fight, it was a message. In Pelican Bay, every second was a battle for survival. If you weren't careful, you could lose your life before lunch. But how did it get to this point? What drives men to live every day like a war zone inside California's most notorious Supermax? That's where our story begins. The arrival at Hell's Gate. The bus carrying new inmates rumbled down a remote highway in Northern California, surrounded by thick redwood forests. The men inside weren't going to an ordinary prison. They were being delivered to Pelican Bay State Prison Supermax, a place designed to break the strongest. When the doors opened, the men were blinded by harsh floodlights. They stepped into a world of concrete, steel, and silence. The walls stretched high into the mist, razor wire glistening in the cold air. Inside, the cells were 8 by 10 feet, just enough for a steel bed, a toilet, and despair. No windows. No sound except the echo of your own breath. Inmates called it the box, and for good reason. At first, some tried to adjust, reading old books, doing push-ups on the concrete floor, or scribbling letters they knew would never be answered. But boredom soon turned into madness. The isolation clawed at their minds like invisible fingers. Yet even in this silence, danger lived in the shadows. Gang rules controlled the prison. It didn't matter who you were before, you had to pick a side to survive. Refuse and you became prey. Just when it seemed calm, the first extreme event struck. A young inmate, barely 20 years old, refused to join a prison gang. The next morning he was found bleeding on the floor of the shower, stabbed with a homemade shank carved from a piece of metal. His blood was the first warning to every newcomer. Pelican Bay doesn't forgive weakness. The politics of survival. In Pelican Bay, survival wasn't about strength alone, it was about politics. Every race, every gang, every clique had carved its territory. Mexican Mafia, Aryan Brotherhood, Black Guerrilla Family, Nuestra Familia. These weren't just names. They were invisible governments ruling the prison from inside the cells. If you wanted to eat, to walk the yard, even to sit at a table, you followed orders. The gangs decided when riots would happen, who lived and who died. Guards watched, but even they knew the real power didn't come from the towers, it came from inside the blocks. But under all the rules, some inmates still tried to resist. One man, a former boxer from Los Angeles, tried to keep to himself. He didn't run with anyone, didn't follow orders. At first, people respected his silence. But in Pelican Bay, neutrality is suicide. One day in the Chow hall, he picked up his tray. Another inmate stepped in front of him and said, "You don't belong here." Within seconds, fists, trays, and boots rained down. By the time guards dragged him out, his jaw was shattered. The message was clear. In Pelican Bay, you either belonged to someone, or you belonged to no one, and that meant you wouldn't last long. But the violence didn't stop there. Later that week, 2 rival gangs clashed in the yard. It started with words, then fists, then steel. Homemade knives flashed under the California sun. Sirens screamed, rubber bullets fired, and the yard turned red. Another extreme event, 2 bodies carried away on stretchers. The price of isolation. Most of Pelican Bay's prisoners spent 22 to 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. The lights never went off. The walls pressed closer each day. Some inmates cracked under the pressure. They'd scream for hours, bang their heads against steel doors, or whisper to voices that weren't there. But some found ways to cope. They talked through vents, tapping codes on the walls, creating a secret language of survival. Others found creativity, writing poetry, drawing tattoos on scraps of paper, or carving small chess pieces from soap. Still, the loneliness was crushing. One prisoner kept a pet, a spider, feeding it crumbs from his meals, just to feel like he wasn't completely alone. Then came another extreme event. During a rare recreation hour in the dog-run cages, 2 men, supposedly from allied gangs, were placed side by side. The guards thought it was safe. But within seconds, one of the men produced a sharpened piece of steel hidden in his shoe. He lunged through the bars and stabbed the other again and again while screaming, "This is for the streets." Blood pooled on the concrete. Guards fired warning shots, but by the time they broke it up, it was too late. The prison whispered about it for weeks. If allies could turn on each other, then no one was truly safe. Hunger and power. In Pelican Bay, food wasn't just fuel, it was power. Meals were cold, small, and tasteless, but in a world where everything was controlled, even a carton of milk could spark a war. Some inmates used food as currency. A pack of ramen noodles could buy protection. A piece of bread could pay for a favor. But food could also be a weapon. Once, guards deliberately served spoiled meat to an entire block. The smell of rot filled the cells. Prisoners banged on doors, shouted, and rioted inside their cages. When orderlies refused to serve it, they were punished too. The hunger made men desperate. One inmate, locked in solitary, refused meals for 2 weeks, demanding better food. His ribs showed, his skin turned gray, and yet the guards ignored him. When they finally opened his cell, he collapsed onto the floor, barely alive. And then came the next extreme event, a full-scale food riot. Trays were hurled across the Chow hall. Inmates climbed on tables, fists swinging, knives flashing. Guards stormed in with shields, batons cracking skulls as they dragged men out. The riot ended in silence, but everyone knew. Even a meal could spark a war inside Pelican Bay. Betrayal in the ranks. Sometimes the greatest danger wasn't an enemy, it was a so-called friend. Informants, known as snitches, lived in constant fear. If a man was suspected of giving information to guards, his life was worth less than a cigarette butt. One inmate had been quietly talking to officers, passing them notes about a planned escape. His cellmates began to suspect. They watched him closely, whispering when he walked past. One night they decided to test him. They told him to deliver a message to another block, a code only a loyal member would understand. But he panicked, stumbled over the words, and gave himself away. The next morning, as he returned from the showers, 3 masked inmates ambushed him in the corridor. Shanks flashed, blood sprayed, and within seconds he was on the ground. Guards blew whistles and dragged his body away, but by then the damage was done. The block went silent. Everyone knew what it meant. Betrayal is the fastest way to die in Pelican Bay. And just when it seemed things couldn't get darker, a new extreme event loomed, rumors of a massive gang war brewing inside the prison. Every corner whispered the same thing: the big one is coming. The calm before the storm. For a brief moment, Pelican Bay seemed almost quiet. The cell blocks hummed with the usual routine. Steel doors clanging, guards making rounds, prisoners staring at nothing. On the surface, it looked like just another day in the Supermax. But underneath, whispers spread like wildfire. Rumors said the gangs were preparing for something big. Men tapped messages through vents, tiny folded kites passed from cell to cell. Each note carried the same warning: stay ready. The war is coming. Still, daily life continued. Inmates worked out in their cells, some drew tattoos on scraps of paper, others played chess with carved soap pieces. It was routine, but it was the kind of routine that felt like waiting for a bomb to go off. And then, without warning, the storm broke. In the Chow hall, a fight erupted between 2 groups, at first fists, then steel blades. Guards rushed in, but suddenly another block joined in, turning it into a full-scale riot. Tables flipped, food flew, and blood streaked across the floor. The air was filled with screams and sirens. By the time it ended, 3 men were carried out on stretchers. The big one had officially begun. War in the blocks. After the riot, Pelican Bay became a war zone. The prison administration locked everything down, but that only made tensions worse. 4 days, inmates were trapped in their cells, banging on the doors, shouting across the block. The air was thick with rage and fear. The gang started sending out orders, clear instructions on who was marked for death. Men sharpened toothbrush handles into blades, hoarded scraps of metal, and prepared for the next explosion. But in between the chaos, there were strange moments of quiet. Some men prayed, clutching tiny handmade crosses. Others wrote letters to families they hadn't seen in years, as if they knew something final was coming. Then came the event that shook the prison to its core. During a routine escort down a corridor, 2 guards were jumped by inmates who had somehow slipped out of their cuffs. The men slashed at them with hidden shanks, trying to take their keys. Alarms blared, boots thundered, and gunshots echoed as officers fired warning rounds from the towers. The guards survived, but barely. One was carried out bleeding heavily. The message was clear: this wasn't just gang-on-gang violence anymore. Even the guards weren't safe. Shadows and solitary. To break the tension, the prison put dozens of inmates in solitary confinement. The idea was simple: separate the leaders, cut off communication, and starve the gangs of power. But solitary was its own kind of battlefield. The cells were silent, but the men weren't. They shouted through the vents, pounded messages into the walls, and passed kites under the doors. Solitary didn't stop the war, it just made it colder, quieter, and more dangerous. Some inmates lost their grip. Days blurred into nights. One man screamed until his voice went hoarse, scratching messages into the wall with his fingernails. Another whispered to himself for hours, convinced the shadows were speaking back. But then came a chilling extreme event. Guards opened a cell door to check on an inmate who had been silent for 2 days. What they found froze them in place. The man lay on his bed, chest carved with words written in his own blood. No one knew if it was a message, a warning, or just madness taking over. From that day, prisoners whispered a single phrase across the blocks. Pelican Bay eats men alive. Blood in the showers. Even locked down, even watched by cameras, violence found a way. The showers were supposed to be secure, one inmate at a time, guarded by officers. But all it took was a single mistake. One afternoon, 2 men from rival gangs were accidentally scheduled for shower time in adjoining stalls. Guards thought the steel bars between them were enough to prevent trouble. They were wrong. One prisoner had sharpened a piece of plastic and hidden it inside a soap bar. The moment he saw his enemy, he struck, jabbing through the gaps, again and again. Blood splattered the tiles as the victim screamed for help. Guards rushed in, but the damage was already done. The news spread fast. Not even the showers were safe. Every corner, every second could be your last. The administration responded by tightening control. Strip searches became brutal, cells were flipped upside down daily, and privileges were cut back to almost nothing. The pressure cooker was ready to explode again. And it did, when another extreme event erupted. A guard found a full stash of homemade weapons hidden behind a loose tile in a cell block. The discovery meant one thing: a massive coordinated strike was about to happen. The brink of collapse. By now Pelican Bay was hanging by a thread. Guards walked the tiers with hands on their batons, eyes darting at every movement. Inmates were tense, waiting for the signal that could start another riot. For some, it was business as usual, lifting makeshift weights, writing letters, staring at the ceiling. But for others it was survival hour by hour. Every sound in the corridor made hearts race. Every clang of steel felt like the beginning of the end. Then came the event that pushed everything past the brink. During a transfer between units, a group of inmates broke free and charged at another rival group. Guards tried to stop it, but chaos ripped through the block. Shanks flashed, boots stomped, and bodies collapsed. In less than 3 minutes, 4 men were left bleeding on the floor. The prison sirens screamed, lockdown slams echoed, and the warden called for emergency reinforcements. Pelican Bay had reached the edge of total collapse. A deal with the devil. After the last riot, the prison locked down tighter than ever. Meals came through steel slots, lights stayed on 24/7, and inmates had almost no contact with each other. But desperation makes men inventive. Some began plotting in whispers through the air vents, trading favors, promising protection. Others turned to guards, offering information in exchange for small privileges, an extra meal, a few minutes of phone time, even a pencil stub. One man in particular thought he was clever. He passed information to officers about where weapons were hidden. For weeks he lived comfortably, thinking he had secured protection. But Pelican Bay has a way of exposing secrets. Word got out. The block grew silent when he walked past. Whispers followed him, but he ignored them. One morning as he stepped out for yard time, a masked figure rushed him. A blade flashed. Blood splattered across the concrete. Guards dragged him away lifeless. The message was loud and clear. Betrayal has only one price in Pelican Bay: death. The smuggler's game. Even in a fortress like Pelican Bay, contraband found its way inside. Tiny cell phones, drugs, and blades slipped through staff, visitors, or clever schemes. Some inmates used fishing, tying weights to long lines made of torn bed sheets, then sliding them under doors to trade with other cells. A piece of soap, a stolen pen, or even a bag of sugar could be sent across the tier. But contraband wasn't just about comfort, it was about survival. Drugs bought influence. Blades kept you alive. Phones connected leaders on the inside with gang members on the streets. The administration knew this, so searches became constant. One day, during a surprise raid, guards found something shocking. A stash of 9 handmade knives hidden inside a hollowed-out law book. That discovery sparked the next extreme event. Furious at the loss, one gang sent a message. That night, an inmate slipped out of his cell during showers and attacked another man with a sharpened toothbrush. By the time guards broke it up, the victim lay bleeding on the wet tiles. The prison boiled with tension again. Everyone knew, if weapons were still flowing in, the war wasn't over, it was just changing shape. The mind games. Life in Pelican Bay wasn't just about fists and blades, it was about the battle for sanity. Some prisoners used their time to sharpen their minds. They studied law books, filed appeals, and fought their cases from inside. Others slipped further into madness. They screamed all night, smeared words on walls, or spoke to people who weren't there. One man wrote daily letters to his mother, even though she had passed away years earlier. Another carved chessboards into his floor, playing both sides of the game alone. For some, imagination was the only escape from the concrete tomb. But madness often bred violence. One afternoon during yard time in the dog cages, an inmate began pacing, muttering to himself. Suddenly he rushed the bars, screaming, and began clawing at the man in the cage beside him. Guards fired beanbag rounds, but the frenzy didn't stop until both men were dragged away in bloodied restraints. The rest of the block whispered afterward, "If the prison doesn't break your body, it will break your mind." The guard's dilemma. For the officers working Pelican Bay, every day was walking a razor's edge. Some tried to do their job by the book. Others cut deals, turned a blind eye, or even helped gangs smuggle items in. Power corrupts, and inside Pelican Bay, it was always for sale. One young rookie guard refused to play along. He reported older officers who were suspected of sneaking in contraband. He thought he was doing the right thing. But soon he noticed graffiti scratched into the walls near his post, "Dead man walking." His tires were slashed in the parking lot. Rumors spread that a gang had put a hit out on him. Every step he took inside the block felt like his last. The extreme event came one night during rounds. As he walked past a row of cells, a prisoner hurled a hidden cup of boiling water mixed with soap through the food slot. It splashed across his face, burning his skin. He collapsed, screaming as other inmates banged their doors in chaos. The message was brutal. Guards weren't untouchable either. The breaking point. By now, Pelican Bay was running on fear. Guards were exhausted, inmates were restless, and the warden knew control was slipping. Every hallway echoed with tension. Still, some inmates found strange moments of humanity. A man taught another to read by shouting words through the vents. Another drew pictures on scraps of paper and passed them through fishing lines. Even in darkness, they clung to tiny sparks of life. But sparks can't stop an explosion. During chow time, an inmate stood on a table and shouted, "Today it ends." He pulled a shank from his waistband. Others followed, pulling their own weapons. In seconds the room became a battlefield. Trays smashed, blades tore through flesh, and guards stormed in with batons and shields. When the dust settled, 4 men were dead and dozens injured. The prison went into the longest lockdown in its history. The entire facility buzzed with one thought. Was Pelican Bay collapsing from the inside? The longest lockdown. After the bloody Chow Hall riot, Pelican Bay entered its harshest lockdown ever. Cells stayed sealed day and night. Food was slid through slots, recreation was cancelled, and lights never dimmed. At first, inmates thought it would only last a few weeks. But weeks turned into months. Men lost track of time. Days blended into nights. Some scratched calendars into the walls, others just stared at the ceiling until their minds wandered into darkness. In the silence, a strange routine developed. Inmates tapped coded messages through the walls, sharing jokes, stories, even prayers. It was a fragile form of brotherhood in a place built to crush it. But the tension was far from gone. After 3 months, the guards finally allowed small groups into the yard. That's when the extreme event struck. On the very first day of outdoor time, 2 rival gang leaders locked eyes across the cages. They shouted coded commands. Within seconds, men erupted, charging at the fences, fists pounding steel, blades flashing through the bars. The yard filled with chaos as guards fired rubber bullets. Smoke canisters hissed. By the end, several inmates lay bleeding, dragged across concrete. The lockdown hadn't ended the violence. It had only bottled it up until it exploded. The hunger protest. Desperate for change, some inmates turned to the only weapon they had left, their bodies. A hunger strike began. At first, only a handful of men refused food. But soon dozens joined, pushing their trays back through the slots untouched. Days passed. Men grew weaker. They lay on their bunks, eyes sunken, whispering prayers or curses. Guards walked the tiers with clipboards, counting who was still eating. The administration ignored it at first, assuming it would pass. But it didn't. By week 2, men collapsed in their cells. Some had to be carried out on stretchers. Medical staff scrambled to keep them alive. The prison buzzed with tension as outside media caught wind of the strike. Then came the extreme event. One inmate, after 21 days without food, collapsed in his cell and never got back up. His death spread like wildfire across the blocks. Men banged on their doors, shouting in rage and grief. Guards rushed in to regain control, but the fire had already been lit. The hunger protest wasn't just about food anymore. It had become a symbol of defiance against Pelican Bay itself. The secret alliance. While chaos tore the prison apart, something unusual began brewing in the shadows. Alliances between enemies. Two rival gangs who had spent decades locked in blood feuds quietly agreed to stop attacking each other. They passed word through coded messages and whispered conversations. Their reason was simple: they were tired of losing men to endless violence. For a moment, the blocks felt calmer. Men traded small goods without fights. The yard had fewer eruptions. Guards even began to believe the worst was over. But alliances in Pelican Bay are fragile. A single betrayal can destroy everything. It came when a hidden stash of drugs went missing. Fingers pointed, accusations flew, and trust shattered overnight. The extreme event hit during yard time. Men from both sides, who only days earlier had shared cigarettes, turned on each other. Shanks flashed, fists cracked, and the so-called peace pact dissolved in blood on the concrete. The guards dragged away nearly a dozen men. The alliance was dead and Pelican Bay was once again on the brink. Fire in the block. The tension reached new heights when someone decided to strike fear in the boldest way possible. One night, during the dark hours when guards were thin on patrol, smoke began to rise from a cell block. An inmate had set fire to his mattress, shoving it against the bars. The flames roared, smoke filling the corridor. Inmates screamed, banging on doors as alarms blared. Guards rushed in with fire extinguishers, dragging men from their cells. The heat melted plastic, filling the air with choking fumes. For a terrifying moment, it seemed like the entire block could burn down. When the flames finally died, the cell was a blackened shell. The inmate who started it was carried out unconscious, his body covered in burns. The fire was more than just destruction. It was a message. The prisoners could burn the whole place down if they wanted to. The administration tightened the screws again, but everyone whispered the same chilling words. If fire can reach Pelican Bay, nothing is safe anymore. The blood oath. Inside the chaos, some prisoners took desperate measures to prove loyalty. Gangs demanded absolute obedience, and betrayal was punished with death. In one block, a group of young recruits was forced to take a blood oath. Each man cut his palm with a razor, letting drops fall onto a torn piece of cloth. They swore their lives to the gang, vowing never to disobey orders. For days they carried themselves with new pride. They belonged to something. They had protection. But Pelican Bay is a place where oaths are tested quickly. The test came when one recruit was ordered to attack another inmate. At first, he hesitated. His victim was a man he had known from his neighborhood outside. But hesitation in Pelican Bay is deadly. Other gang members watched closely, waiting. In the showers, the recruit finally struck, stabbing his old acquaintance in the back. The man collapsed, blood spreading across the wet floor. Guards dragged them both away, but the message was clear. Once you swear an oath in Pelican Bay, blood is the only currency. The whisper networks. By now, Pelican Bay was living on edge. Every hallway echoed with suspicion. Inmates trusted no one because even the smallest whisper could get a man killed. Messages traveled through kites, tiny notes written on scraps of paper, slid under doors or passed on fishing lines. One wrong word in those notes could seal a prisoner's fate. Guards knew the kites were dangerous, so they cracked down. They began searching cells, ripping apart mattresses, flipping toilets, and tearing down vents. Dozens of notes were found, exposing names, debts, and orders for hits. But the crackdown backfired. The gangs realized someone inside had been leaking information. And when paranoia grows in Pelican Bay, it always ends in blood. The extreme event came in the middle of the night. A prisoner was dragged from his bunk by his own cellmate. Shanks flashed in the darkness and screams filled the block. By the time guards arrived, the suspect snitch was gone. The message spread. In Pelican Bay, silence isn't just golden, it's survival. The phantom escape plan. Not many men even dreamed of escaping Pelican Bay. The walls were high, the guards were armed, and the forests around the prison stretched for miles. But whispers began to spread of a phantom escape plan. Supposedly, a group of inmates had found a weakness in the system, an air duct leading out of the segregation block. They said all they needed were tools, time, and luck. For weeks, prisoners tapped messages in code, trading scraps of metal, hoarding wires, and mapping the prison in their heads. It was madness, but in a place built to crush hope, even the illusion of escape was powerful. Then came the extreme event. Guards discovered a section of vent cover pried loose, screws hidden under a bunk. The men involved were dragged out in chains, beaten, and thrown into deeper isolation. But the damage was done. The entire prison buzzed with rumors of escape, even if none had truly happened. The administration feared it, the gangs fueled it, and paranoia spread like fire. The deadly silence. After the escape scare, the warden enforced another silence lockdown. No talking during chow, no movement in the yard, no sound at night. Guards prowled the tiers, waiting for the smallest violation. At first, the silence was eerie. Inmates stared at their trays, at their walls, at nothing. But silence inside Pelican Bay never lasts, it only builds pressure. One evening, during meal distribution, a guard noticed two men staring too long across the tier. No words. No signs. Just a stare that burned like fire. Moments later, the silence broke. A prisoner lunged through his food slot with a hidden blade, slashing at the guard's arm. Blood splattered across the concrete. Inmates erupted, pounding on their doors, screaming, while officers scrambled to contain the chaos. The silence was shattered, and replaced with raw violence. The monster in the block. Every prison has its legends, stories whispered about certain men who were more feared than others. In Pelican Bay, one inmate earned a reputation as the monster in the block. He was huge, covered in tattoos, and never spoke. Guards said he could bend steel with his bare hands. Other inmates avoided even looking at him. Rumors claimed he had killed 3 men before ever arriving at Pelican Bay. For months he remained quiet. Then one morning during showers the monster finally struck. Without warning he lunged at another inmate, lifting him by the throat and slamming him against the steel bars. Guards rushed in, batons swinging, but it took 5 men to pull him off. The victim was carried away on a stretcher, unconscious, ribs shattered. From that day forward, inmates whispered his name like a curse. And yet some admired him. In a place where survival meant power, the monster became both a nightmare and a legend. The riot that shook Pelican Bay. The tension could no longer be contained. Every gang, every block, every man was on edge. All it needed was a spark. That spark came during yard time. 2 men began fighting, just fists at first. But fists turned into blades. Allies jumped in. Enemies followed. Within seconds the yard exploded. Dozens of inmates charged each other, knives flashing in the sun. Guards fired warning shots, smoke bombs hissed, rubber bullets cracked the air. The watchtower sirens screamed as officers rushed the yard with shields. It was one of the largest riots Pelican Bay had ever seen. Bodies lay scattered, blood staining the concrete, smoke drifting through the chain-link fences. When it finally ended, the yard was littered with injured men. Some didn't get back up. The prison had reached its boiling point. Pelican Bay was no longer just a prison, it was a battlefield. The whisper networks. By now, Pelican Bay was living on edge. Every hallway echoed with suspicion. Inmates trusted no one because even the smallest whisper could get a man killed. Messages traveled through kites, tiny notes written on scraps of paper, slid under doors or passed on fishing lines. One wrong word in those notes could seal a prisoner's fate. Guards knew the kites were dangerous, so they cracked down. They began searching cells, ripping apart mattresses, flipping toilets, and tearing down vents. Dozens of notes were found, exposing names, debts, and orders for hits. But the crackdown backfired. The gangs realized someone inside had been leaking information. And when paranoia grows in Pelican Bay, it always ends in blood. The extreme event came in the middle of the night. A prisoner was dragged from his bunk by his own cellmate. Shanks flashed in the darkness and screams filled the block. By the time guards arrived, the suspect snitch was gone. The message spread. In Pelican Bay, silence isn't just golden, it's survival. The phantom escape plan. Not many men even dreamed of escaping Pelican Bay. The walls were high, the guards were armed, and the forests around the prison stretched for miles. But whispers began to spread of a phantom escape plan. Supposedly, a group of inmates had found a weakness in the system, an air duct leading out of the segregation block. They said all they needed were tools, time, and luck. For weeks, prisoners tapped messages in code, trading scraps of metal, hoarding wires, and mapping the prison in their heads. It was madness, but in a place built to crush hope, even the illusion of escape was powerful. Then came the extreme event. Guards discovered a section of vent cover pried loose, screws hidden under a bunk. The men involved were dragged out in chains, beaten, and thrown into deeper isolation. But the damage was done. The entire prison buzzed with rumors of escape, even if none had truly happened. The administration feared it, the gangs fueled it, and paranoia spread like fire. The deadly silence. After the escape scare, the warden enforced another silence lockdown. No talking during chow, no movement in the yard, no sound at night. Guards prowled the tiers, waiting for the smallest violation. At first, the silence was eerie. Inmates stared at their trays, at their walls, at nothing. But silence inside Pelican Bay never lasts, it only builds pressure. One evening, during meal distribution, a guard noticed two men staring too long across the tier. No words. No signs. Just a stare that burned like fire. Moments later, the silence broke. A prisoner lunged through his food slot with a hidden blade, slashing at the guard's arm. Blood splattered across the concrete. Inmates erupted, pounding on their doors, screaming, while officers scrambled to contain the chaos. The silence was shattered, and replaced with raw violence. The monster in the block. Every prison has its legends, stories whispered about certain men who were more feared than others. In Pelican Bay, one inmate earned a reputation as the monster in the block. He was huge, covered in tattoos, and never spoke. Guards said he could bend steel with his bare hands. Other inmates avoided even looking at him. Rumors claimed he had killed 3 men before ever arriving at Pelican Bay. For months he remained quiet. Then one morning during showers the monster finally struck. Without warning he lunged at another inmate, lifting him by the throat and slamming him against the steel bars. Guards rushed in, batons swinging, but it took 5 men to pull him off. The victim was carried away on a stretcher, unconscious, ribs shattered. From that day forward, inmates whispered his name like a curse. And yet some admired him. In a place where survival meant power, the monster became both a nightmare and a legend. The riot that shook Pelican Bay. The tension could no longer be contained. Every gang, every block, every man was on edge. All it needed was a spark. That spark came during yard time. 2 men began fighting, just fists at first. But fists turned into blades. Allies jumped in. Enemies followed. Within seconds the yard exploded. Dozens of inmates charged each other, knives flashing in the sun. Guards fired warning shots, smoke bombs hissed, rubber bullets cracked the air. The watchtower sirens screamed as officers rushed the yard with shields. It was one of the largest riots Pelican Bay had ever seen. Bodies lay scattered, blood staining the concrete, smoke drifting through the chain-link fences. When it finally ended, the yard was littered with injured men. Some didn't get back up. The prison had reached its boiling point. Pelican Bay was no longer just a prison, it was a battlefield. The echoes of madness. After the riot in the yard, the prison entered a strange phase. The blocks grew quieter, but it wasn't peace, it was paranoia. Men sat in their cells, eyes wide, staring at the walls. The silence wasn't calm. It was the kind of silence that came before an earthquake. Some inmates started breaking under the pressure. One scratched the same word into his wall over and over, freedom. Another shouted numbers all night, convinced they were a code to unlock his door. The guards ignored it, but the noise spread like infection across the block. Then came the extreme event. During morning rounds, officers found a man hanging from his bedsheet. The silence shattered as prisoners began banging on their doors, some in rage, some in fear. In Pelican Bay, even death was contagious. The guards strike back. The guards had had enough. After months of riots, assaults, and chaos, they began their own form of rebellion. No more patience. No more tolerance. Searches became brutal. Cells were torn apart, belongings smashed, even family photos ripped to shreds. Inmates were dragged out and pinned to the concrete during shakedowns. The tension turned into a war of humiliation, guards against prisoners. But retaliation always sparks retaliation. One night, while a guard passed by a food slot, an inmate reached out with a hidden blade and slashed his leg. Blood poured down his uniform as alarms echoed. The message was undeniable. Both sides were now playing for keeps. The chain reaction. The prison had become a powder keg. Every corner, every meal, every walk down the hall could ignite disaster. Then a single spark set off a chain reaction. A guard shoved an inmate too hard during a search. The prisoner cursed back. Another inmate chimed in. Within seconds the whole block erupted, men pounding on doors, shouting, throwing whatever they had. The guards stormed in with shields, pepper spray filling the air. But the riot spread beyond one block. Other tiers heard the noise, saw the smoke, and exploded too. By the end of the night, half the prison was under emergency lockdown. Fires smoldered, alarms screamed, and men lay in restraints across the floor. The chain reaction proved one thing. Pelican Bay wasn't just unstable, it was uncontrollable. The last spark of defiance. After months of blood, riots, and madness, Pelican Bay had become a pressure cooker with no release. Guards were burned out. Inmates were scarred and restless. Everyone felt the end coming, it was just a matter of what form it would take. That final spark came during yard time. Two rivals locked eyes through the chain-link fence. No words were spoken, but everyone in the cages knew it was about to erupt. Then, like fire to gasoline, violence exploded. Men rushed the bars, stabbing through the mesh, screaming in rage. The guards fired beanbags and pepper spray, but the chaos was uncontrollable. The yard became a storm of fists, blades, and blood. It was the last riot of the season, and when it ended, the floor was littered with injured men. The survivors dragged themselves back to their cages. The message was clear: Pelican Bay would never truly know peace. The aftermath. The riot left scars on everyone, guards and prisoners alike. The warden declared another indefinite lockdown. Ambulances carried away the wounded. Families on the outside were notified their loved ones would not be coming home. In the silence that followed, some inmates finally broke down. Hardened men wept in their cells. Others sat motionless, staring at the walls, numb to the violence that had become their reality. Yet even then Pelican Bay refused to die quietly. A group of prisoners began planning again, passing kites, whispering through vents, preparing for the next fight. The cycle never ended. The extreme event came one morning, when officers discovered another stash of weapons hidden inside a broken light fixture. Even after everything, the war machine kept turning. The human cost. For outsiders, Pelican Bay was just a name, a fortress on the northern coast of California. But for those inside, it was a machine built to grind down human souls. Men lost decades of their lives inside those walls. Some lost their minds. Others lost their families, their names, and eventually their lives. One inmate once wrote in a letter smuggled out, "Pelican Bay is a place where the strong survive and the weak disappear. But even the strong don't leave whole." That truth became clear when another body was rolled out on a stretcher. Another man claimed by the prison's endless hunger. Guards didn't even flinch anymore. Death had become part of the routine. Survival behind bars. Still, through all the madness, some men found ways to survive. They read, they exercised, they clung to memories of the outside world. Some found faith, whispering prayers in the darkness. Others survived through sheer stubbornness, refusing to be broken, even as everything around them crumbled. They counted each day, scratching marks into the wall, telling themselves that one day the gates would open. But survival came at a cost. Everyone who left Pelican Bay carried scars, on their bodies, in their minds, and in their souls. The extreme event that closed this chapter was simple but haunting. A prisoner finally stepped out after serving his time. The gates opened and he walked into the sunlight, free at last. But his eyes were empty. The man who left was not the same as the man who had entered. The legacy of Pelican Bay. Pelican Bay Supermax was built to be unbreakable, a fortress that would cage the most dangerous men alive. But in trying to break them, it became something darker, a place that consumed both the guilty and the innocent alike. The prison story is not just about crime or punishment. It's about survival, what men do to endure the unendurable. Some fight. Some break. Some die. And some walk out alive but never truly free. Pelican Bay remains standing, a grim reminder of how thin the line is between order and chaos. Inside its walls, the cycle of violence, betrayal, madness, and survival continues, day after day. And the final truth is this. In Pelican Bay, survival behind bars is the greatest crime story of them all. This was Pelican Bay Supermax, where hope and horror collide, and where survival is the only law that truly matters. If you found this story gripping, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime tales from the inside. Until next time, stay safe. And remember, the walls may keep them in, but the stories always find their way out.